Broadcasting from the Hip Hop Weekly studios, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Civic Cypher, where our mission is to foster allyship, empathy, and understanding. I'm your host, Ramses Ja.
He is Ramses Ja. I am Q Ward. You are tuned into Civic Cypher.
Indeed you are. And we have a problem.
Just one?
No.
Oh, okay.
We have several problems.
I just wanted to make sure we're clear.
But today we are going to be dealing with a problem that has become sort of a cancer in terms of how this country moves and how decisions are made and how progressive thinking has been compromised. For those that know and for those that listen to the show, you understand this basic truth is that the tendency of humanity over the course of time has been more progressive. We are kinder to each other. We do things that will make our lives better and make the lives of those around us better, etc. And certainly in the history of this country on a much smaller timeline, our tendency has been a little bit more progressive.
I have an interesting viewpoint on what you just said. 24 hours ago, I wouldn't have agreed with you. But as I'm listening to you say it now, something just hit me, and I think you're right. We're just being manipulated a bit.
Yeah. Let's get to it. But today we are going to spend a good amount of the show talking about Christian white men. This is something that has come up a lot in recent weeks and months, and how these people, there's a concerted effort to shape the country around some of the principles of the Bible that they choose to espouse and live their lives by, or at least want everyone else to live their lives by. And it causes a great deal of harm, a lot of which we will discuss in today's episode. But before we get there, let's start, as always, with some Ebony Excellence.
Shall we?
I think we shall. And why don't you take this one, because it's a little bit in the sports lane, and I know you love those.
Rams is just hilarious with regards to sports. Somehow I'm the czar and he has no idea, which neither are true. But today's Ebony Excellence, sponsored by Actively Black. Visit activelyblack.com. There is greatness in our DNA. Story comes from Essence. Raja Karuth became just the third black driver to win a NASCAR National Series race when he drove to victory at the Las Vegas Motor Speedway on March 1st. The 21-year-old Winston-Salem State University senior and NASCAR Drive for Diversity program graduate also earned pole position. It's the best starting position in a race for the first time in his career during the qualifying session ahead of the race. He said, and I quote, "I'm pretty speechless. It's been a tough journey so far," end quote. Caruth told NASCAR.com, quote, "A lot of people have helped me get to this point. Thank you to every single one of y'all. Definitely ups and downs, but this journey has been fruitful at times and testing at others. This winter was a lot of uncertainty about where I'd be driving, not having a bunch of funding behind me. I just stayed true to my faith and my family. Fortunately, a lot of people put a lot of stuff together for me in this spot," Caruth said. CBS Sports reports Caruth is one of the most promising talents to emerge from NASCAR's diversity program in recent years. With his win, Caruth joins Wendell Scott, who became the first black driver to win the NASCAR National Series in 1963. Bubba Wallace, who won in 2021, becoming the second black driver to achieve this feat in the 76-year history of the sport. After the big race, Caruth thanked his parents for supporting his love for the sport. He said, and I quote, "I'm really glad my parents are here, especially my dad." And shout out to this young champion.
Absolutely. Well, I like starting off with some Ebony Excellence because it helps us to know that we are more than just these grim stories that we share. And hopefully you get that from us starting off on that.
Yeah, it's interesting that we had to build Ebony Excellence into the show because so often the tone and the feel of our show is kind of the opposite of that.
Sure.
And just a way to keep us and our listeners in good spirits and in a good headspace.
Yeah.
We had to make sure that every show included some great triumphant news about, our brothers and sisters around the country and around the world. Now,
there was something that you said before we get into kind of the meat and potatoes here. I was mentioning how our tendency, certainly in this country, has been toward a more progressive agenda, lifestyle, etc. And it inspired a thought. And I want to make sure that we discuss that before we get into what we're getting into, because it's going to be kind of heavy.
It'd be easy to feel that the opposite is true. How can we be more progressive, more united, more like brothers and sisters now than before, when everything that we see happening in our legislation, in our courts, and by our lawmakers and in our country seems to spit in the face of that idea, seems to be trying to drag us backward. But when you stop and pay attention to it, you realize that there is a masterful level of manipulation happening to the citizens of the entire world, not just of this country. And what brought that to my attention was thinking about the way the world responded first to George Floyd and second to COVID. Even though there were conspiracy theorists, even though there were large segments of every population that pushed back, for the most part, the governments and populations of every country in this world kind of beat the same drum for a few months at least. Mm-hmm. Hey, this thing could get rid of all of us. Mm-hmm. So all of us need to collectively do something to take care of each other. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Most people got the vaccine, not because they believed in the efficacy of the vaccine, not because
the system was perfect or the rollout,
perfect, and not because they even believed that it was the best option for them, but for their parents, for their grandparents, for their children, sure, for those who had autoimmune deficiencies, for those who could not make sure they took care of themselves. Mm-hmm. So our humanity as a world global population was put on stage in that moment. Mm-hmm. And a very large portion of that population said, you know what, for everybody else, I'm going to do this thing, even as they're still trying to figure out if that's the best version of it, even if while they're still testing and while we are now a part of the trials for mm-hmm. this, right? Yeah. So that's, when you think about that, that's very encouraging that most of the world, for the rest of the world, made that decision mm-hmm. based on not just keeping themselves and their own posterity alive, but the people around them that, so weren't as strong as they were.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think that really does help explain what it is that we're here to talk about today. Because, when we all need to come together, when we recognize and respect the fact that we are a part of a tapestry, this is a human family that we're a part of. I think that we're at our best selves, right? But as I mentioned, there is a facet, certainly in this country, that feels like they should be the deciders. And this is their country. And this is their government. And they should be at the top. And I don't want to beat up on, because obviously I'm talking about straight Christian white men, healthy straight Christian white men. And I don't want to be unkind, because I realize that the world around them is changing and they feel very threatened by that. When you've been in first, but this is me, you can push back. you guys should CQ. But these are our brothers. I would not call the rest of us brothers and sisters and leave them out, right? And I have to respect the fact that when you've been in that position for such a long time and the world around you starts changing and you've never been in a different position, a lower position, if you will, it can be very scary. Not saying it's right. I'm just respecting the humanity behind the reaction, right? In other words, I can see people succumbing to fear and taking all these drastic steps and pushing back harder than ever, right? Against a decidedly overall progressive agenda, okay? And in the scale of countries, over the scale of hundreds of years, of course, there has been a tendency toward a more progressive societal framework, okay? In the span of one lifetime even. But in the span of 20 years, 30 years, that could go back and forth, maybe a couple of times. Now, because we're talking about straight Christian white men, our brothers, we have to explain what is going on with this group of folks some of the people in this, because, sometimes people will say, it's not all people. And there are people who push back against that, right? Well, don't say not all of them, because then it like sidesteps the problem. I push back against that. I think it's important to say not all people. Indeed, we're going to show one such individual who qualifies as a straight Christian white man, who's a state representative from Texas. He goes by the name of James Tallarico, and he is one of our brothers, but he's one of the people who's identifying this white Christian nationalist agenda that has infiltrated our politics, that has served to ultimately dismantle abortion protections, affirmative action. There's a concerted effort to elect officials that espouse this very old school way of thinking. And, on the second half of the show, we're actually going to talk about one such individual who had a lot to say. He's a minister himself, but he had a lot to say from a pulpit of a mega church, a mega church, about Dr. King, about Black people, about women, etc. And these aren't isolated incidents, but we're going to use a handful of these to explain to you this movement and kind of the nature of the movement. So before we get there, let's play this video from James Tallarico so you get an understanding of how he explains this white Christian nationalist movement.
Christian nationalism is on the rise. 3 years ago, Christian nationalists stormed the U.S. Capitol, killing police officers while carrying crosses and signs reading "Jesus saves." 2 years ago, Christian nationalists on the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, allowing states like ours to outlaw abortion even in cases of rape and incest. And as we speak, Christian nationalist billionaires are attempting to dismantle public education in the state of Texas and therefore dismantle democracy. Let me be very clear. There is nothing Christian about Christian nationalism. It is the worship of power, political power, social power, economic power in the name of Christ. And it is a betrayal of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus never asked us to kill police officers. Jesus never asked us to ban books, silence teachers, or defund schools. Jesus never asked us to control women's bodies. Jesus never asked us to establish a Christian theocracy. All he asked was that we love thy neighbor.
So, again, this is a Christian white man who is explaining this white Christian nationalist movement. And I want to make sure that we shout out, I believe that came from D.L. Hughley's Instagram page where we got that. So you can go and check that out for yourself and you can see for yourself exactly who's talking. Now, for the first part of the show, I'm going to share a couple of examples of how this looks. And you need to know this. And I wanted to speak to the fears that are kind of prevalent in these groups so that if you're having conversations with people like this, you kind of know where they're coming from. It doesn't matter if their fears are well-founded in your mind. All that matters is that their fears are well-founded in their minds. And speaking to those fears, I think that's where you begin to have conversations that can be constructive. Now, I'll admit, before I give you both of these examples I'm about to give you, that some of these folks are in the deep end. But the fact remains is that they are our brother on this show. They are our brothers, right? That's if you're on this planet with us and we were both created by the same maker, whoever you decide that is, then you are our brother. And we will hold out, even when it's tough, we will still hold out a modicum of grace for some forgiveness for you.
God bless you, Ramses John.
We have to. Otherwise, what's the point of all this, right? So first thing, I want to share this with you. I don't have it to share like in terms of the clip because it's a little vulgar, but you're welcome to go check this out on TMZ. The long and the short of it is that there is a gentleman by the name of Emmett Martin, I believe is his last name. He was being interviewed by an NBC journalist named Shaquille Brewster. Okay. And Emmett is a white man, older, I'd guess, somewhere in his 50s, maybe early 60s, somewhere in there. And then Shaquille Brewster is a young black man. Not that that matters, but just so that you can find the video if you choose to search it out. And Shaquille is interviewing him, trying to get a sense of who he's going to vote for, and if he's interested in voting for Nikki Haley, which we know she's dropped out of the race. But at the time when this video came out, it gave some
Has she
insight.
officially?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But at the time when this video came out, it really shows how some of this thinking has really come back and retaken kind of a center stage, back when men were men and women were happier for it, right? This sort of, again, old school way of thinking, this non-progressive mindset.
There unfortunately are women who do still subscribe to that ideology because they do see the benefits in having the patriarchy and all that comes with it.
Sure. I recognize and respect that there's people of all walks of life and all colors who can see benefits in all sorts of things. But the overwhelming numbers suggest that this is a very conservative, very Christian, very white, very male way of thinking. That's where you're going to find the strongest cohort of individuals who support this way of thinking. So one of the things that he said is that he's not going to vote for Nikki Haley because she lacks the anatomy necessary to scratch herself. It was really just
such a wild.
It was really weird and it was vulgar. And I understand that these
intentionally vulgar though.
These are isolated examples, sure. And I know, but let me say this. These are individuals that are saying this, right?
Say that, because isolated is not honest.
That's fair. Okay. These are individuals. And I don't love it when people take a couple of individual examples and string together a narrative. But the fact is that these examples do support something that has been journalistically documented from credible sources, and that the white Christian nationalist movement has become more radicalized, has moved further to the right, has moved further away from the gospel of Jesus Christ than ever before, and on and on. And all of these things have resulted in power grabs and a pushback against, again, more progressive reforms that have allowed for more advancement for other people in society. The thing about what Emmett said that really stood out to a lot of people and why he was making headlines on TMZ and elsewhere is he said women, again, he's talking about Nikki Haley, but he says women are only good for having babies and taking care of the house. Okay. So this kind of gives you another aperture into that way of thinking, right? Now, I want to move to another example.
Before you move on, important to point out that you think something like that as an opinion would be an auto disqualifier for him and people that think like him, right? Like you think if a politician was running for office and came out and shared that type of rhetoric, that at least to the women voters in the country, that they would be automatically disqualified and have no support from women voters. That is sadly untrue.
I'm glad you mentioned that too, because one of the things that I think that stems from a lot of the fear in this country, fear of mass shooters, fear of immigration invasion, fear of the great replacement. For those that don't know, there's this theory on the far right that suggests that white people are being systematically replaced by Jewish people. And it's a very bizarre thing. And it's really old school theory. And so far, nothing like that has even gotten close to happening. But in the right circles, this is a very real fear for these people. And one of the things that we've learned recently is that people who have a tendency to be more fearful of the unknown tend to be more conservative in their voting. And so fear is particularly susceptible to, or rather, people who are conservative are, how am I saying this? People who have a tendency to be more fearful tend to be more conservative with their vote. Okay, I'll just say it that way. And people who are less afraid tend to be more willing to take chances and to lean into their more empathetic feelings, even if it presents a small risk to themselves personally, right? And so we have to understand that a lot of times these people are dealing with a great deal of fear. And so the great replacement and these other elements that have become kind of conspiracy theories in these circles are very real. They're very vivid to these folks. Now, I want to share another story. This one comes from NBC. You mentioned elected officials. So this one comes from Missouri. The Missouri Republican Party said Thursday it was working to remove a Republican candidate for governor from the primary ballot after a picture of him appearing to do a Nazi salute while standing in front of a burning cross resurfaced online. In the picture, the candidate, Darrell Leon McClanahan III, is seen apparently saluting alongside a hooded man in Klan robes. Quote, the Missouri Republican Party has been made aware that Darrell Leon McClanahan III filed for governor as Republicans despite his affiliation with the Ku Klux Klan, which fundamentally contradicts our party's values and platform, unquote.
That's right.
The party said in a post on X Thursday. It goes on to say, we have begun the process of having Mr. McClanahan removed from the ballot as a Republican candidate. Okay, I want to finish this and then we'll touch on this. McClanahan responded in a post saying, in part, quote, the GOP knew exactly who I am. What a bunch of anti-white hypocrites. In a statement to NBC News, McClanahan indicated he'd fight the move. Quote, I filed legally and lawfully, he said. They will need to file a civil complaint to remove me. McClanahan's campaign website describes him as, quote, the conservative voice for governor of Missouri, and lists one of his campaign promises as opposing the woke agenda. So what I want to mention here is that I do believe that he's right, that they knew exactly who he was. They had to distance himself when the pictures resurfaced. And rather than him saying, oh, no, that wasn't me, or, that's Photoshop or AI, he's like, no, you knew who I was. And I'm going to sue you to continue to run.
Calling them anti-white. The irony.
Sure.
It's almost laughable.
Sure. And you see how that rhetoric, it almost suggests that he has a decidedly white agenda. And you mentioned something before we started recording today that I thought was really dope. And I think that you kind of got inspired by Dave Chappelle, but effectually what you communicated was that everybody in China is Chinese. And I want you to expound upon that for our listeners.
Yeah, it was. I've been trying to figure out a way to articulate what he was trying to say. And when he said it, it just made so much sense. Everyone in China is Chinese. Everyone in Australia is Australian. Only here do our leaders and our government see us as other. So when they make policy and when they make decisions, it is not with us in mind. It is only with a certain segment of the population in mind. And it's fully intentional that way. So even if we don't agree with the way that other countries govern, when they do something that is for the benefit of China, it is for the benefit of all people that are Chinese, at least in theory. Here, that's not even the truth in theory. It's very, very open and very, very straightforwardly not to benefit minorities and poor people, unfortunately.